The Pacific theater of the Second World War was an arena shaped not only by industrial power and military doctrine, but by the willpower, instincts, and desperation of the men who fought in the vast empty skies stretching between island chains. By 1944, the conflict over the Pacific had transformed into a brutal contest of attrition. The Japanese Empire, once a formidable air force with some of the most experienced aviators in the world, was steadily losing its elite pilots. The Zero, once unmatched at the beginning of the war, was now aging under the relentless pressure of rapid American technological advancement. And within this changing landscape, individual pilots often made the difference between life and death, not only for themselves, but for entire squadrons. This is where one man enters the story. His name has been lost to history, buried in fragmented unit records and forgotten after-action reports. But his maneuver and evasive tactics, so unusual, so counterintuitive, and so daring, momentarily shifted the balance in the sky. It became one of the rare instances where a single pilot's improvisation allowed a much weaker force to escape the jaws of superior American firepower. His maneuver would later spread through surviving Japanese air groups in the form of whispered stories, half-remembered instructions, and hastily drawn sketches on briefing room chalkboards. To American pilots, particularly those flying the deadly P-51 Mustang, it was briefly known as the corkscrew phantom, a strange spiraling motion that made a Zero nearly impossible to target. But before describing the maneuver itself, we must understand the environment that produced it, the desperation, the machinery involved, and the mental state of the men who flew in the Pacific skies during the final phase of the war. For by the spring of 1944, the Japanese air arm was in crisis. Many of its legendary aces had been lost over the Solomon Islands, the Marshall Islands, and New Guinea. The grueling campaigns had consumed the empire's most talented aviators. The replacements, often barely trained, were sent into battle against American pilots, who were now not only more experienced, but armed with superior machines and overwhelming numbers. The P-51 Mustang, introduced into the Pacific in growing numbers by late 1944, was a masterpiece of wartime engineering. Its supercharged engine allowed it to climb faster, dive harder, and sustain higher speeds than the Japanese Zero. Its laminar flow wings gave it exceptional performance at high altitude, and its rugged airframe could absorb damage that would have torn a Zero apart. The Americans who flew the Mustang had long ceased to fear dogfights against Japanese fighters. They respected their enemies' bravery, but not their equipment. The Zero, once a terror, now represented little more than a fragile silhouette, flammable, lightly armored, and increasingly flown by pilots with little combat grounding. Yet even in this lopsided struggle, surprising events occurred. On a warm afternoon somewhere west of the Marianas, a patrol of American P-51s encountered a small formation of Japanese Zeros returning from a failed reconnaissance sortie. The Japanese pilots were low on fuel, flying at an altitude disadvantage, and completely unaware that the Americans were descending upon them from above. With the sun at their backs, it should have been a quick, one-sided engagement, and at first, it was. The Zeros were shot down in the opening dive, spiraling into the sea before their pilots could even react. The remaining aircraft dispersed, each pilot using whatever instinct or training remained to buy a few more seconds of life. But among these fleeing aircraft, one Zero did something unusual. Instead of braking left or right, instead of diving for speed or climbing for altitude, both predictable and easily countered by Mustang pilots, the Zero began a slow roll. That at first seemed like the beginning of a desperate, sloppy defensive maneuver. The Mustang leader prepared to fire, expecting the Japanese pilot to continue rolling into a standard evasive spiral. But what happened next caught him off guard. The Zero stopped its roll abruptly, tilted at an unnatural angle, then initiated a second roll in the opposite direction, only to interrupt the motion halfway through. From the Mustang's perspective, the aircraft appeared to be quivering in the air, unable to decide which direction to commit to. Yet strangely, it maintained forward momentum. The erratic series of half rolls, abrupt pitch changes, and off-axis turns created a bizarre wobbling pattern that disrupted the American pilot's gun solution. To understand why, we must remember that aerial gunnery in the Second World War relied heavily on prediction. Gun sights, whether simple reflector sights or more advanced lead computing models, depended on a stable target. Even wild evasive maneuvers typically follow predictable patterns: a defensive spiral, a high G break, a sudden dive. But this maneuver was different. It was not smooth. It was not fluid. It exploited the Zero's extremely low wing loading, allowing it to momentarily float in the air at altitudes that would have caused a heavier aircraft to stall. Each micro-movement threw off the Mustang's aim by fractions of a degree that compounded into wide misses. As the P-51s attempted to close in, they found themselves continually overshooting. Their superior speed became a disadvantage. Every time an American pilot tried to predict the Zero's next move, the Japanese pilot would interrupt the pattern with another abrupt motion. The Mustang pilots later described it as trying to shoot a leaf being tossed by invisible hands. This strange, stuttering flight path forced the attackers into repeated repositioning attempts, giving the Zero just enough time to reach a layer of cloud cover that saved his life. When the engagement ended, the American squadron returned to base puzzled. The surviving Japanese pilot, meanwhile, landed with his fuel nearly exhausted, unaware that he had just performed one of the most remarkable escape maneuvers of the Pacific War. A maneuver born not from doctrine, but from desperation, instinct, and intimate familiarity with the Zero's flight characteristics. This event was not recorded in formal Japanese tactical manuals. It was never given an official name, yet eyewitness accounts from both sides would ensure that the memory of this strange aerial dance survived the destruction of the Japanese air arm. And it is here, in this moment of improvisation, that our deeper exploration begins. To understand how a single Japanese pilot could improvise an evasive maneuver so unconventional that it disrupted the firing solutions of experienced Mustang pilots, we must look beyond the event itself. We must understand the man who created it, his training, his environment, and the psychological forces shaping him in the final year of the war. Although the pilot's exact identity remains lost, historical reconstruction based on tactics, regional unit assignments, and survivor testimonies gives us a coherent picture of who he likely was. By mid-1944, the pilots still serving in frontline Japanese naval air units fell into two categories. The first consisted of the remnants of the pre-war elite men trained under rigorous, almost brutal standards. These aviators had undergone a multi-year process of selection, discipline, and combat seasoning unmatched by any other air arm at the start of the war. They had survived the early Pacific campaigns, witnessed the loss of countless comrades, and endured the shift from dominance to desperation. The second category consisted of replacement pilots shown, often undertrained men who had been rushed into combat with only minimal flight hours. Their instructors were dead or depleted. Their curriculum had been shortened. Their understanding of aerial combat was largely theoretical. These new pilots, no matter how brave, rarely survive long enough to develop creative tactics. Our pilot almost certainly belonged to the first group. His actions reveal a level of air sense, instinctive control, and mechanical familiarity that cannot be taught quickly. Only a veteran who had logged hundreds of hours in the Zero could perform those split-second, off-axis transitions without stalling the aircraft. The Zero's light frame and exceptional lift characteristics made it nimble, but it was also unforgiving. Mishandling it in evasive flight could result in an abrupt loss of lift or catastrophic over-control. Yet this pilot manipulated the aircraft with such fluid precision that he kept the Zero flying within an envelope where the Americans could not predict its behavior. To fully grasp his skill, we must revisit what it meant to be trained as a Japanese naval aviator before the war. Candidates underwent a selection process that eliminated more than 90% of applicants. Those who passed were subjected to rigorous training that emphasized endurance, discipline, and mastery of flight fundamentals. Physical training bordered on the monastic. Pilots practiced takeoffs, landings, aerobatics, and formation flying until their reflexes became instinctual. Even before combat, they flew hundreds of hours, far more than most Allied pilots prior to 1942. But the war changed everything. By 1944, the flow of fuel, aircraft, and experienced instructors had collapsed. Veteran pilots sometimes found themselves acting not only as combat aviators but also impromptu teachers, trying to pass on years of knowledge to raw recruits in mere days. This constant stress weighed heavily on them. Many lived in a perpetual state of exhaustion, yet they also possessed something that new pilots lacked: a profound, intuitive understanding of the Zero's aerodynamics. The Zero was an extension of their bodies. They felt its vibrations, its stalls, its potential. They knew where its limits were, and in the chaos of battle, they could flirt with those limits while still retaining control. This was the kind of pilot who could summon an unprecedented maneuver when the situation demanded it. But skill alone cannot explain the pilot's decision. Something deeper was at work, a psychological shift unique to the final phase of the Pacific War. By 1944, Japanese pilots understood they were fighting a losing battle. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an industrial colossus. The early optimism of 1942 had evaporated. The grim reality of attrition hung over every briefing. Most missions ended in silence, empty chairs in the mess hall, aircraft that never returned, names quietly erased from duty boards. The pilots lived with the knowledge that they were unlikely to survive long enough to see the war as end. This environment forged the types of mental responses. Some pilots became fatalistic, embracing death with a calm, almost stoic acceptance. Others, despite the hopelessness, fought with a desperate ingenuity, a refusal to surrender life until every final option had been exhausted. Our pilot belonged to the latter category. His escape maneuver was not reckless, it was calculated. He did not accept death passively. He chose to challenge the overwhelming odds with creativity rather than resignation. The maneuver itself reveals his mindset. It was not a traditional dogfight tactic. It was a psychological weapon. By disrupting the expected, he forced the Mustang pilots into a state of confusion. And confusion, even for a few seconds, was enough for survival. This mindset was rare, but not unheard of. In the late war Japanese air groups, there were scattered reports of highly experienced pilots adopting unorthodox methods: strange rolls, erratic brakes, feints, sudden throttle changes designed specifically to counter the superior speed of American fighters. These improvisations were not standard, not taught, and not written. They emerged from moments of pure necessity, forged in the instant between life and death. One instructor's memoir, written decades after the war, mentions a senior pilot who told us that unpredictability is the last weapon of a man outmatched in every other way. This philosophy captures the essence of our pilot's thinking. He understood that American pilots relied on energy tactics, boom-zoom attacks, high-speed dives, and superior acceleration. The Mustang's power worked best against predictable opponents. The Zero, however, could exploit chaos. By flying erratically at the edge of stall speed, the Japanese pilot forced the Americans to fight in the Zero's domain: close, unstable, and difficult to predict. His maneuver also hints at a profound emotional state. It was the act of someone who had nothing left to lose, yet still refused to die meaninglessly. This was neither cowardice nor panic. It was a final assertion of agency in a sky where every advantage belonged to the enemy. He chose to survive not because he believed victory was possible, but because he believed that living one more day had meaning in itself. This psychological combination of elite training, combat experience, and the desperate clarity of a man facing impossible odds created the conditions for one of the most unusual evasive maneuvers of the Pacific War. And as we move deeper into the story, we begin to see that this single moment was not an accident, but the culmination of everything the pilot had become. The moment the Japanese pilot rolled inverted, the battle changed from a pursuit to a performance, one that defied logic, physics, and every expectation the Mustang pilots had carried confidently into the fight. From the American perspective, it looked like the Zero was not merely turning but folding itself into the sky, slipping between the seams of the air like a creature that weighed nothing. The P-51s were machines of power, speed, and modern engineering. The Zero was something else entirely, an extension of the pilot's will. A blade more than an aircraft, sharpened by years of discipline and a culture of flight that demanded nothing less than perfection. The Americans expected the pilot to commit to the dive. That was the rational choice. The P-51 held the advantage in terminal velocity. Once the Zero tried to escape downward, it would become an easy target. But instead, the Japanese pilot did something no one anticipated. He tightened his inverted roll into an oblique climbing arc, using the sun as cover, as though gravity itself had loosened its grip on the aircraft. For a second, the Mustang leader hesitated, not physically, but mentally. What he was witnessing made no sense. A Zero, especially an older model, should not have been able to do that with such speed and precision. The maneuver was not merely aggressive, it was almost suicidal. At that angle and altitude, a single mistake would have torn the wings off or sent the aircraft into a spin that not even the most experienced pilot could recover from. But the Japanese pilot flew as if consequences did not exist. To the P-51 leader, a veteran who had seen nearly every trick in the book, the motion resembled something closer to a martial art than aerial combat. He would later write in his report that the Zero moved as if the pilot had rehearsed the maneuver 1,000 times in total darkness. The description was not far from the truth. Japanese flight training before the midpoint of the war had been brutal, unforgiving, and steeped in traditions that predated the aircraft themselves. Pilots learned not only to control their machines but to become indistinguishable from them. They flew by instinct sharpened to a blade's edge, reacting to the smallest vibration, listening to the engine as though it were a living partner. As the Zero reached the top of its arc, the P-51s attempted to follow, but they were forced to widen their turn. Physics betrayed them. Energy retention favored the American fighters during dives and straight-line speed, but not during tight rotational maneuvers at low speeds. The Mustangs felt heavy, strong, but unwilling, like war horses trying to mimic the agility of a dancer. The Japanese pilot, sensing the gap, continued into a downward corkscrew, the sort of maneuver that only a pilot who understood the limits of his aircraft intimately would attempt. To the Americans, it looked like madness. To the Japanese pilot, it was mathematics written in motion. He exploited the Zero's lightweight frame, its low wing loading, and its exceptional responsiveness. Unlike the metal-skinned Mustangs, the Zero carried its fragility as a strength. Every quiver of the airflow, every sound of changing pressure, every subtle shift of lift across its canvas-covered wings communicated with the pilot. In his hands, the aircraft did not resist. It obeyed. As he dove, leveled, and executed a sudden high-G snap turn to the right, the Mustangs overshot. The sudden change in direction seemed impossible. Even in training films, the Americans had never seen such a maneuver executed so cleanly. Normally, a Zero forced into such a motion would lose airspeed or stall. This one did not. It was as if the pilot had pre-calculated the exact moment when the airflow would detach from the wing and pull back just before it happened. The Mustang pilots tried to regain position, but the engagement had already shifted into chaos. Their formation broke as they attempted to predict the Zero's next move. A rookie pilot might have panicked, but these were experienced men, professionals, combat-proven, and yet they were shaken. For the first time in the fight, they were reacting to the enemy instead of forcing the enemy to react to them. The Zero leveled off only 30 feet above the ocean, skimming the surface so low that the propeller misted the water into a shimmering trail. It was a dangerous gambit. One mistake, one miscalibration of altitude, and the aircraft would have plunged into the waves. But the Mustang leader recognized the tactic. The Japanese pilot wanted to mask his position against the reflection of the sunlit water, using nature as a shield. The Americans dove after him, but the sea's glare made it difficult to judge altitude. One wrong move and the P-51s could slam into the ocean before realizing their mistake. Above the waves, the Zero nosed upward again, using stored momentum to launch into a steep climb. The P-51s attempted to match the ascent, but the Zero's lighter frame allowed it to rise at a sharper angle, even if only for a brief moment. The Mustang pilots knew that once the Zero lost its kinetic energy, it would be vulnerable. But the Japanese pilot was not climbing to gain altitude. He was positioning himself for another brake turn. On the radio, the Mustang wingman muttered, "What is he doing?" The leader replied, "Something we're not trained for." When the Zero reached the apex of its climb, it executed a barrel roll so tight the Americans thought the wings would snap clean off. Instead, the maneuver brought the Japanese pilot directly above and behind the trailing Mustang, if only for a fraction of a second. The moment was too brief to take a shot, but that wasn't the point. The purpose was psychological. The Japanese pilot was demonstrating control so absolute that he could put himself in an offensive position simply to unsettle the enemy. And it worked. For the first time in the encounter, the Mustang pilots felt something rare: uncertainty. They were flying superior machines, yet they were being outmaneuvered by a pilot who refused to follow any predictable pattern. It was as if he were fighting not for survival, but for mastery, testing the limits of motion, exploring angles of engagement that textbooks didn't cover. The P-51 leader understood then that he was facing not an ordinary pilot, but an artist, one of the last remaining masters of a style of aerial combat that would vanish with the end of the war, a style born from discipline, sacrifice, and a belief that the spirit mattered as much as the machine, a style that modern aircraft, with their overwhelming power, would make obsolete. The maneuver created an illusion, the kind only desperation invents, to the Mustangs. He seemed to vanish. The sudden skew of his aircraft, paired with the sun's angle behind him, erased him from their sights. One pilot later described it as like watching a fish slip between your fingers. Another simply said, "He disappeared." In reality, he had done nothing mystical, only something so violently counterintuitive that no one expected it. But the sky, indifferent to logic, briefly obeyed his madness. Inside the cockpit, however, the world was collapsing into a tunnel. His blood, forced downward by the dive and sideways by the abrupt roll, dragged his consciousness toward darkness. He felt the weight of the world stack upon his chest, a crushing, suffocating force that turned breaths into thin gasps. The Zero rattled violently, as though it resented being pushed beyond its comfort, beyond its design. Still he held the stick, knuckles whitening, jaw locked in pure refusal. He thought not of country, not of honor, not of victory. In those moments men rarely think of such things. What crossed his mind instead were fragments. A childhood afternoon watching birds soar above rice paddies, the smell of the ocean from his training base, his mother's hands tightening his flight scarf the last time he saw her. These memories passed in flashes, neither sentimental nor poetic, simply part of the brain's frantic attempt to anchor itself against extinction. The Mustangs regained sight of him almost immediately, but almost as a luxury fighters could not afford. In repositioning, they lost their clean shot. For a handful of seconds, those same 10 seconds that would later fuel speculation and myth, the Japanese pilot existed in a pocket of sky where death could not reach him. And then came the final motion. Not a heroic climb, not a cinematic reversal, but a controlled chaos. Pulling back from the dive, he forced the Zero into a climbing arc that should have been reckless. Yet because the Mustangs had overshot, because the roll had broken their formation, because the sun had momentarily blinded one and disoriented another, the arc worked. He slid into a blind spot beneath their wings, the one place where none of their guns could reach. The Mustangs corrected quickly, but by then the moment had passed. The hunters regained formation, but their prey had regained distance. Not victory, not escape, only distance, the most fragile kind of salvation. When the Japanese pilot finally leveled the aircraft, The trembling in his hands was uncontrollable. His vision steadied slowly, colors returning like cautious guests. The engine, overstressed but still alive, growled with a deep metallic complaint. And in that strange quiet, broken only by wind and machinery, he understood the enormity of what had occurred. He had not outgunned them. He had not outpowered them. He had survived through a single act of raw, unfiltered instinct to maneuver that no doctrine, no training, no flight manual would ever teach. The story of that maneuver, passed quietly from pilot to pilot, from crew chief to intelligence officer, eventually became something more than a tactical anecdote. For the American pilots who witnessed it, it became a lesson in the unpredictability of war. They had trained to face a certain type of pilot discipline, methodical, operating within the known characteristics of his aircraft. But what they encountered in those skies was a man who broke the pattern, who defied the expected, and who, by doing so, forced even experienced Mustang pilots to question their assumptions. It reminded them that an enemy could be cornered, outmatched, exhausted, and still capable of something extraordinary. For the Japanese side, the incident became a whispered reminder of the Zero's unique strengths. By 1944, the aircraft was hopelessly outdated compared to the newer American fighters, yet in the right hands, with an instinctive pilot at the controls, it could still force moments of uncertainty onto the battlefield. Veterans and post-war memoirs occasionally reference wild evasions, maneuvers so aggressive that even surviving them was considered a miracle. Few ever matched the extremity of this one, but all shared the same underlying truth. The machine mattered, but the man mattered more. In the decades following the war, as historians sifted through logbooks and military archives, events like this one were nearly lost. The Pacific conflict produced such a colossal volume of combat encounters that individual dogfights blurred into one another. But pieces of the story survived not as official records, but as side notes scrawled in margins, passing references in interviews, and the quiet testimony of pilots who had nothing left to prove. One American pilot, interviewed in the 1970s for an oral history project, recalled the scene with startling clarity. "We had him," he said. "3 Mustangs on 1-0. Should have been a clean finish. And then he did something I still can't explain. You don't forget a man who chooses to live that hard." Another pilot described the moment more simply. "The guy didn't escape. He bottomed. And for some reason, we let him have it." These reflections reveal something essential. Combat is not simply about killing the enemy. It is about confronting the unpredictable, the irrational, the deeply human. Every pilot, regardless of nation, felt fear, fatigue, doubt. Every pilot carried memories of home, of family, of promises made before boarding their aircraft. And in those moments where survival hung by a thread, instinct pure, unfiltered often replaced doctrine. The Japanese pilot's evasive role was not a tactical trick taught in training. It was closer to a reflex born of desperation, a burst of creativity ignited by terror. And yet, paradoxically, it was the very element desperation turned into action that made the move effective. When the war finally ended, the Zero faded from the skies, replaced by the next generation of aircraft. The men who flew them aged, their memories softening at the edges. Some returned to peaceful lives, others struggled in silence, and many never spoke of what they had seen at all. The nameless pilot, assuming he survived the war, likely lived the rest of his life without ever knowing the impression he left on those chasing him. Perhaps he returned to a farm or a workshop or a quiet coastal town. Perhaps he carried the weight of the war with him, as so many veterans did, in ways invisible to others. He may never have told his family or his children about the day he outmaneuvered 3 P-51 Mustangs. Such stories rarely sound like glory when told by those who lived them. They are too raw, to near death, to private. But history, though imperfect, has a way of preserving its most astonishing moments, not through medals or official commendations, but through the reverence of those who recognize what they witnessed. The American pilots who observed that evasive move did not speak of it with bitterness or pride. They spoke of it with respect. They had seen a man bend the laws of probability with nothing but instinct and stubborn will. They had watched someone refuse to die. And in the great, complicated tapestry of the Pacific War, the refusal, however small in scale, added a threat of humanity to a conflict often reduced to numbers and strategies. The legacy of that unnamed pilot lies not in what he achieved, but in what he embodied. His maneuver did not change the outcome of the war. It did not prevent defeat, nor alter strategic trajectories. What it demonstrated, however, is something far more universal and timeless, that even in the most mechanized, technologically advanced form of warfare humanity had ever seen, the defining factor remained the human heart. Machines could climb faster, dive harder, fire more accurately, but machines did not feel fear. Machines did not cling to life. Machines did not gamble everything on a split-second decision. He did. And so his story survives not in textbooks, not in official histories, but in the quiet awe of those who know what it means to fight for seconds in a sky, where seconds decide everything. His maneuver stands as a tribute to the unpredictable brilliance that arises when survival becomes the only objective. It reminds us that history is not just the movement of armies or the decisions of leaders. It is also the desperate roll of a lone aircraft over the Pacific, the 10-second window in which death hesitated, and the pulse of a man who refused to let go. In that sense, his legacy is not simply a wartime anecdote. It is a reflection of the oldest truth about humanity. When pushed to the edge, we sometimes become more than anyone, including ourselves, ever expected.